Welcome back, everyone. This is the Changelog, and I'm your host, Adam Stacoviak. This is episode 174. Talking Metasploit today with Trevor Rosen and James Egypt Lee. These are the guys behind Metasploit, which is the world's most used penetration testing software. Great show today. We had 4 awesome sponsors: CodeShip, TopTal, Harvest, and Transloaded. Our first sponsor is CodeShip. CodeShip launched a brand new feature called Organizations a few months back. Everyone's been loving it. Now you can create teams, you can set permissions for your specific team members, and you can improve collaboration in your continuous delivery workflows. You can maintain your centralized control over your entire organization's projects and teams with this new feature. It's super awesome. And you can save 20% off any premium plan you choose for 3 months by using our code, the Changelog Podcast. Again, that code is the Changelog Podcast. 20% off any plan you choose for 3 months. Head to codeship.com/thechangelog to get started. And one more thing I want to tell you about. Sean Devine is doing an API workshop called API First Training. And guess what? He's going to use CodeShip as a demo tool. The URL to learn more about that API training is in our show notes, so check those out. But now, on to the show.
Welcome back, everyone. Jared here. Today I'm joined by 2 interesting guys. This is Trevor Rosen and James Egypt Lee, 2 of the people behind the Metasploit project, which is the world's most used penetration testing software. Trevor, Egypt, welcome to the show.
Thanks
for having us.
So we're here to talk Metasploit. We're here to talk InfoSec. We're here to talk open source. Lots of interesting topics out there. But first, let's let the audience get to know you guys a little bit. And Trevor, I'll start with you because we met at GopherCon, which is a bit of a theme lately. I feel like that conference was quite a boon to our podcast because we lined up a lot of new friends and a lot of guests for the show.
Yeah, I can imagine. It was a great con. It was one of my all-time favorite cons that I went to. So my name is Trevor Rosen. I work at Rapid7 on Metasploit as the leader of the architecture team, which is a small team, kind of mostly software-oriented people who work all different areas of the Metasploit framework and the Metasploit commercial applications. So Metasploit framework is this sort of famous thing in the information security world. It's been around for a little over 10 years, and it exists basically to help you help penetration testers, which is like kind of good guy hackers, good person hackers, I should say, white hats, help determine what an organization's level of exposure is to security threats. And so I get to work in all different areas of our stacks on all sorts of fun open source stuff, mostly Ruby software and quite a bit of stuff in the Rails ecosystem. And I'm not really a full-time security person in that I don't do security research really, but I definitely have a lot of fun working on open source, and I'm a big fan of what open source can be for the security world. I feel like it's really vital.
So were you always in security side of things, or did you start off as a programmer? What's kind of your background?
Yeah, background is mostly software. I've done a bunch of different startups and things. I always kind of had a soft spot for security, though. I was the guy on the team that was like, in mapping everything on our production boxes and finding open ports and, haranguing ops guys about that, or trying to hack my dev environment for fun.
For sure.
Yeah, and then, I mean, back in the day as a kid, I may or may not have built some hardware that wasn't 100% legal. I these days mostly sort of I would say I fall into the maker side of things, and I mean by that not like Make Magazine, but sort of like security. The security software world kind of has people who are interested in sort of breaking stuff and hacking it and figuring out how to make it do something crazy or weird, and then people who are much more interested in sort of just making good software.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really where I guess I would put myself as kind of more on the maker end of the spectrum.
That's an interesting way to put it because I came to a similar conclusion as I was telling you in the pre-call. I do have a bit of a security background, studied information assurance as a concentration in college, and was doing penetration testing and mapping stuff like crazy, which was like one of my favorite things to do. But I too I found myself after that deciding I'd rather create things than tear them down. I also wasn't that good at it. I don't have that like mindset. I'm sure you guys are well aware in Egypt, maybe you're one of these kind of people where like you can just find a way to break everything. I was like okay at it, but I didn't have like that intuition that some folks have. And I do like creating, so I can kind of relate with you a little bit there. Let's move on to James, who I've been told not to call that. I've been called, his name's Egypt. But James Egypt Lee, want to go ahead and introduce yourself to the crowd?
Yeah, I'm Egypt pretty much everywhere, and I'm Egypt on Twitter, etc. I'm the Metasploit community manager here at Rapid7, and that means that I'm writing a lot more emails than code these days.
Oh man!
At least for the last couple of months. But I'm sort of involved in open source contributions and getting people interested in the project, as well as fixing the old bugs in code that no one else has looked at in years. So I started with the project in roughly 2006. I started using it professionally as the thing I was writing my exploits in, working as a security researcher. And I found bugs and problems and things that just didn't work the way I wanted them to. So I started submitting patches. And around 2008, HD Moore, the founder of the project, decided that it was easier to give me commit access than to keep taking all my patches all the time. So in 2008, I got commit access to the then Subversion repository and broke master with my first commit.
Oh, you are a breaker then.
Yes.
So what happened? What happened there? Tell us about that.
Well, I with everything I committed for the first couple of months, I would miss some edge case and it would make the main interface not boot up, or something stupid like that.
Well, the framework was not overburdened with regression tests back at that time either, so
right,
it's hard to give you too much blame.
The count of regression tests at that point was 0. And remained so for quite a bit longer. Regression testing has been an ongoing issue for us. But yeah, I spent a lot of time fixing bugs just to make it possible to do some of the evil things that I was trying to do at the time. And that got me in the door with the project. And then in 2009, when the acquisition came about, I was basically the first hire onto the newly minted Metasploit team. So I wrote most of or a lot of at least the back end code for the original Metasploit commercial product. I spent a lot of time there working on the commercial edition as well as the open source stuff. And in the time that I've been working at Rapid7, something north of 80% of all my code has been open source. So that's super helpful. It really adds to the job satisfaction to see my code is going out open source. And it also allows me to interact with a very diverse group of hackers putting together exploit modules and kicking sandcastles and licking cupcakes as we do in the Metasploit world.
Say that again. Kicking sandcastles and licking cupcakes?
Yeah, because that's what you do when you break into a network, right? You're not in there saying, everything is sunshine and rainbows. Yeah. You're ruining someone's day, and you have to do it. You have to do it nicely.
So it's all about.
Imagine a tray of cupcakes, and somebody runs over and licks all of them before anyone gets to eat them. That's what it is to lick cupcakes.
That is incredibly rude. But nice for you because you get to taste the cupcakes, I guess.
That's right.
It is kind of fun, right, when you find your way in. Well, let's not bury the lead here. Let's talk about this name, Egypt.
Yes, it originated as a nickname in college based on my appearance.
So do you look Egyptian?
I guess so.
No, you don't.
Pyramidical? I guess.
Yeah, I'm not really
sure.
I don't know. I had a goatee at the time.
So you look a little bit like an Egyptian pharaoh or something.
I suppose.
And so friends started calling you Egypt, and it just stuck. Trevor, where's your awesome handle?
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't really have one.
I don't have one either.
No, I'm I'm Burley Scud on IRC with 2 Ds and always have been. Points to anybody out there in the audience who knows what that's a reference to.
Burley Scud.
Yeah, because I've had one person in all the times ever figure it out, but it's not super hard. It's just kind of obscure. But yeah, I don't have a super awesome handle. I spend a lot of my time spent a lot of my time since I've been at Rapid7, kind of managing and wrangling cats and being involved in the sort of the ongoing discussions about how we can do the next thing or whatever, that kind of thing.
Sure.
So sort of stumbled backwards into like software as politics almost, I guess you'd say.
So tell me a little bit about Rapid7 as far as the company, the culture, kind of what it is that they do, and then that maybe just intro the relationship to the Metasploit framework.
Sure. So Rapid7 is a security company, a security software firm. It's been around since about 2000, 2001. So pretty long time, actually an unusually long time for what was usually termed a startup to go from its inception through to the IPO that we had this past summer. But it's a firm that had been prior to Metasploit working in the vulnerability management space. You can think of a vulnerability scanner, I guess, and sort of security people in the audience might jump on me for this, but kind of roughly analogous to like a virus scanner for networks or something, like in that like a virus scanner kind of scans your machine for a bunch of like known problems it has or sort of patterns of activity that could be suspicious. A vulnerability scanner is going to scan like a lot of network endpoints, a whole lot of machines on a network, and try to determine what kind of exposure exists there. So that product is called Nexpose, and that's like a Rapid7 sort of large, long time product that we've had. And they're back whenever they decided, and it predated my time with the company, to acquire the Metasploit project. It was sort of along the lines of, okay, we understand a certain, we have kind of half of the equation here in that we're we're doing vulnerability management, we're doing vulnerability scanning. And so that's defensive security, right? That's figuring out what your problems are from a kind of like scanning the equipment you have perspective, and then trying to patch it. But then on the other side of that is like, well, what could you do? What could an attacker do? What could a sufficiently empowered attacker do? And so Metasploit has always existed to help empower people who are attacking because they're being paid to. And it's paid by the company they're attacking, hopefully. And so the idea was sort of we can make a commercial product around that essential notion, that offensive security sort of stance and concept, and it will be complementary to the existing product that I have. And Metasploit is also a pretty big name. If you go to like insecure.org and you look at the SecTools 100, top 100 open source security tools, Metasploit's has, for as long as I've known about Metasploit, which is since significant amount of time before I started at Rapid7, so probably since about 06 or 07, Metasploit was in like the top 5 or top 10. Now I believe it's like number 2 or 3 on the list, like right after like Wireshark and Nmap or something, right? So it's regarded, the framework, the open source tool, as a very essential piece of kit, a very widely known, widely used thing. So Rapid7's kind of overall idea is that there's a lot of insight to be gained from really approaching security as a matter of finding the right data, finding the right insights that you can into what the actual threats are, because quite a bit of security tools just produce incredible quantities of data, but not a whole lot of actionable information about what you should do with that data.
Yeah.
Right. So, our leadership likes to say that for a long time, quite a bit of the security space is predicated on this idea of essentially kind of monetizing fear. It's like, hey, here's a bunch of things to be terrified of. Okay, what do I do about them? Yeah, here's the big phone book sized pile. Figure it out. Right. But we want to go beyond that. That's really the way that Rapid7 wants to operate, is we go beyond that to provide sort of much more in-depth and immediately actionable kind of insight. So we have, in addition to Nexpose and to the Metasploit commercial editions, we also have this really interesting product called User Insight. And User Insight you can think of almost as sort of like an intrusion detection system for user behavior. So instead of kind of saying like, hey, what what types of data are traversing my firewall on what ports, et cetera, et cetera. You can kind of instead you can turn on its head and ask the question like, what are users doing right now, and is that okay? And can you use heuristics to understand, like, hey, today Jared accessed 12 servers that he's never touched before, you know, is that strange, right? And a traditional intrusion detection system might not know about that because it might just be focusing on the perimeter. Like, is someone authorized person getting in, or is some particular high value data getting out? So user insight, again, it's that idea of being able to sort of look at security from a slightly different perspective and say, you know, can we change our perspective a little bit, but dramatically increase the value of the insight that we're producing? So I guess that's kind of Rapid7 in a nutshell.
I think you spawned a product. You spawned a product idea, which I'll give you this one for free. So tell your friends at Rapid7, like, no big deal. They can thank me later. It's a scanner, but it just scans your office, scans every monitor to see if anybody has written their password down on a yellow sticky note and then stuck it to their monitor.
Ooh,
what do you think about that?
Like that.
That's real.
Yeah,
That's real user interaction scanning.
Do you mind if I go ahead and just like start the patent application right now?
As long as you guys give me a shout out, or if
All
just,
right.
just 1% of your first billion, something like that. No big deal. So,
honestly, I would prefer people write their password down somewhere and put it in their wallet rather than leave it in passwords.xls on their desktop.
Yep.
Good point. Or just use one password, not one password, the application, but like literally a single password for, everything that they do. So
nothing bad ever came of that.
Yeah, exactly. On the other side of that coin, you have companies enforcing ridiculously onerous password policies, which require their users to subvert them on a regular basis and come up with all sorts of things.
Right, and those ridiculous password policies lead to like the top 4 passwords in every single organization are summer followed by the year, winter followed by the year, spring followed by the year, fall followed by the year. They are in the top 10 on every organization.
So is there a future for us to just be rid of passwords altogether? Is there a light at the end of that tunnel as a industry or not?
I don't see it. Like, I really want to, but I don't see it. We've moved towards 2-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, but it's so spotty and the support for it is so spread out that most of the time as a pen tester, you get around, you walk all over the network, you kick those sandcastles and lick those cupcakes, and at the end of it, you go and give the report and they say, oh, well, what'd you do about our 2-factor auth? I didn't know you had it. I'm sorry.
Right. So before we get into Metasploit, the details of history and all that, let's talk about penetration testing as a thing. We mentioned it a few times here, but maybe Egypt, could you give us kind of a general definition, and then maybe even like what a security audit looks like from if somebody hires a company like Rapid7? There's a lot of these firms out there that will do it for you. What's the process? What's it about? And kind of what are the results?
Right. So I don't have a lot of insight into the like sales side of it, like who you call and talk to, but I can tell you from the penetration tester side, a penetration tester is given someone to talk to as their point of contact, and they usually have a list of IP addresses that are in scope and don't touch anything outside of those IP addresses. And sometimes though the scope will be really restrictive and say, you're only allowed to look at this web app and you're only allowed to look for cross-site scripting. You're not allowed to look for SQL injection and that sort of thing. And that gets really limiting, and you end up with a report that's not very useful. But sometimes you get a broader scope. You're allowed to look for more things. You're allowed to take more actions. And hopefully those are on not necessarily production networks, but something that, like, if it falls over, you don't lose every customer's data, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of times a penetration test is just a week or 2 weeks long, which means a very compressed time scale for an attacker. A real attacker is going to have months. Right. And a penetration tester is going to have a week or maybe 2 weeks. And one of those days is going to be for reporting. So they really only have 4 days. And you start out, sometimes it's acceptable to scan beforehand, and that saves a lot of time. So As a penetration tester, because of this compressed timescale, you need to find stuff as quickly as possible and identify it as quickly as possible because you're looking at a lot of data. So if you have 1,000 IP addresses that you need to check out, you want to scan those as quickly as possible, and it's going to be super noisy. And so, for example, if there's a firewall in the way or an IPS in the way that says, "Oh, this is a port scan," and then blocks your access, now suddenly that scan is basically invalid. So that happens pretty frequently. And assuming that those roadblocks don't come up, you do your scan, you find out what's available. Usually there's a whole bunch of static HTML, there's a whole bunch of web applications, and not a whole lot else on the outside. Occasionally you'll find the golden FTP server with all of the company's financials on it open anonymously to the public, but that doesn't happen terribly often. I did find a domain controller on the public internet once, so that was fun. But fortunately, that doesn't happen frequently anymore. So then you do your external scans, you find all of the things. If there are a bunch of web applications out there, you spend some time fuzzing input. You look at a thing called Burp Suite, which allows you to muck around with HTTP headers and values. It makes it really easy to fuzz some stuff and to examine responses. There are a number of other tools in that same vein, but Burp Suite's kind of the de facto standard for screwing around with HTTP.
When you say fuzz some stuff, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, basically just throwing values that might break an application. So in the case of if you're looking at a C application, an application written in C, you would be throwing large strings because they might overflow a buffer. In the case of a web application, you might be throwing various kinds of quotes to escape something out of a SQL statement. So those sorts of things. Just trying inputs that are probably bad given the application, hoping for a crash or some aberrant behavior. And so once you get through that step, occasionally you'll end up with external access via something like a SQL injection or a command injection on a web application. And then you start the whole process over again and you scan the internal network. A lot of external engagements require that once you get inside, everything stops until you talk to your point of contact. That's pretty common, which sort of makes sense from the customer's perspective, because you as the person running the network, you want to know when there's a big vulnerability that lets someone into the DMZ or into the production environment. You want to know that as soon as possible. And you also don't necessarily want a penetration tester running around rampant on your production internal network. So a lot of times everything stops, comes to a dead end right there. And you call up your point of contact and tell them the bad news. There is also like social engineering campaigns where you send out a bunch of emails and inevitably someone is going to run the executable. And that gets you usually corporate network access. And again, the thing starts all over again. Now, as a penetration tester or as any attacker, really you're looking to expand your influence. So if I'm coming in from the outside, I'm looking to gain access to either data through SQL injection or possibly shell access through command injection or other sorts of things. If I'm sending in a phishing email, I'm looking to expand my influence instead of into the DMZ, into the corporate network. Usually there's all sorts of information in there that's company sensitive that you really want to get a hold of. The crown jewels are always on somebody's desktop, though, or some file share that's available to everyone in the company. Most of the time, you're not dealing with exploits. When I'm talking to a web app on the external, I'm creating my own exploits for the most part. Most of those things are custom apps.
That's what I was going to ask, is if you are targeting specific, endpoints on a network that are public facing, they're usually web apps. And are you just fuzzing those, or are you actually, inspecting the application and saying, I think this might not be checked, or this could be injectable, and like trying different things by hand, or if you're only using these tools.
Sure, both of those for sure. I mean, in some cases, like you can fuzz a few things and find a couple of interesting responses and say, "Oh, this is probably an injection," and then you'll dive deeper manually.
I see.
With other things, like it, at least when I first started doing penetration testing, every login form was vulnerable to SQL injection. So the first thing you do is put tick or 1 = 1 into the login form, and you get admin. So fortunately, that's not nearly as common anymore.
Then what do? You just go to lunch or something. You're like, well, we're done for the day.
Yeah.
Email the point of contact, and you're done.
No, from that point, you go in looking for credit cards and social security numbers.
You want to lick all the cupcakes, huh?
Exactly.
So, I mean, one thought that comes to mind, and maybe it's just because it's too expensive, but if they're trying, the point of this is to, give us a reasonable idea of maybe not even how secure our network is, but how insecure it is. I think you can guarantee an insecurity, whereas you can't guarantee a security, which is kind of the troublesome part of the business, I think. But if they're trying to be as real world as possible, a black box, here's an outsider with a few IP addresses, which is how people start. Why do they limit you to 4 days? Just because it costs too much to pay you to keep hacking them for 4 months, or what?
Yeah, that's generally the thing. Cost is the deciding factor in a lot of those decisions.
I guess that makes sense. Well, one tool that you use, I'm sure, is Metasploit. We're going to take a quick break, hear from one of our sponsors, and then we're going to dig into all the details of Metasploit, what it is, what it does, why it's useful, and why it's so stinking popular. We'll be right back.
You've heard me talk about TopTal several times on this podcast, but today is different. I've got a special treat for you. I went out and spoke with a listener who a year ago had never heard of TopTal. He listened to the show just like you're doing right here, right now, today, and heard us talk about TopTal and what they're all about, and he decided to get in touch. And now he's living the dream as a freelance software developer with TopTal. His name is Daniel Elzon, and I sat down and I talked with him. I said, hey, what is it that you love most about TopTal? Take a listen.
Well, for me, the thing about TopTal, which I thought would be very hard for me personally as I transitioned to a more consulting role, was the way I would have access to new clients and what quality of those would be. So I found that I've had access to awesome clients through TopTal, and it hasn't been that hard to find because they have a lot of choice. And even more than that, there's enough choice, and I can actually be a little selective about what kinds of things I want to be working on. So I use that as a way to sort of hone my skills and go towards the technology that I think are worth investing in for the future. So whether it's including new front-end frameworks or doing a little DevOps work on the side, I usually am able to find clients who have the needs of the things I want to get better at. So that's been truly useful.
All right, that was Daniel Elzon, a listener of the changelog and also a freelance software developer with TopTal. If you want to follow in Daniel's footsteps, go to toptal.com/developers. That's TOPTAL.com/developers to learn more about what TopTal's all about and tell them the changelog sent you.
All right, we are back, and we are talking about a framework called Metasploit. I like to get into the history because it's been around a while. It's massively popular, and I even recall it from my youngster days at college. Trevor, you mentioned Wireshark and Nmap. Those were definitely tools exposed to us. I think Wireshark was called something different back then. It was like Ethereal. Thank you. And I always thought that was a silly name. Wireshark's a pretty cool name, though. Anyhow, Metasploit was a thing that we used. So that was back in 2005, 2006. So as much as kind of give us a little bit of a history of the project. I know we've talked a little bit about it, but let's recap and when y'all got involved.
Yeah, so it started out as a game. HD Moore, our founder, created it as the game you can play on any network. And it was originally an Ncurses GUI.
Really?
and it had one. It started out with one exploit. It was the Apache chunked encoding overflow,
I
and
remember it
you
well.
had you had the Class C network block uh, as individual pixels, and whenever you compromise the machine, one of the pixels would turn red.
That's awesome.
Uh, yeah, it was super cool, but not very useful at the time.
Yeah.
Um, so it was originally in Perl. It got rewritten in basically an entire rewrite when HD picked up a couple of contributors, SpoonM and Scape. Um, Scape later went on to Microsoft and created a whole bunch of mitigation technologies that made exploitation a heck of a lot harder in terms of memory corruption. So the project went on without him and went on without Spoon. And around 2005, 2006, I started using it for writing my own exploits. And it was about that time when Scape and SpoonM left. And um, that's when it started moving towards Ruby, where it had originally in Perl had a EULA-like license to prevent some of the um, blatant corporate misuse that had been going on with it. Um, and when it moved to Ruby, it maintained that license for a little while. Shortly after I got commit access, um, we changed the license to BSD. So now it's real, full-fledged open source, and you can do anything you want with it. But the great thing about that is that we get somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 unique authors on commits every year for the last 2 to 3 years.
Nice.
So that's really cool, and a lot of them are only a single commit, which is great because it means that someone new is coming in and saying, here is some thing that I see missing, or some functionality that I want to have, and so they write it up and they submit it to it as a pull request, and then they go about their business and they continue using the tool and breaking into networks with it. But they've contributed something that 200,000 people use, which really makes me happy that we can get that kind of contribution from so many unique people.
It is really cool to see. I gotta say, and one thing that I'll add to that is something I think has drawn a lot of people who work on it full time to the project is that Metasploit is now, because it's been around and when it first started, it was sort of controversial, like, oh, we're going to actually publish these exploits, right? We're going to create this sort of library of malware. Well, now it's that notion, where it was sort of very scary and controversial when it first started, is now pretty well understood and is pretty well accepted, even to the point where I think it was in an article in 2012. The New York Times referred to us as a sort of early warning system for malware, and I've kind of always liked that notion of what Metasploit can be. It's sort of like, if you're vulnerable to something in Metasploit, you're doing it wrong, because we're not generally going to be publishing things that have no mitigation available. I mean, there are going to be times when we do that, but it's specifically to help put pressure on vendors and create a good outcome for all of the huge numbers of people who are going to be vulnerable to some given software flaw.
And when we do that, usually if we publish something that has no patch or has no vendor response yet, it's because it's already being exploited in the wild.
Exactly. Yeah. One of my favorite examples is also, I believe from 2012, from late in 2012. I'll get the dates and timing wrong, but there was a large vulnerability in pretty much every browser. There was the way that, like, the bridge from JavaScript to Java that was available, so that, like, in 2005 you could go to like Yahoo Games and play Bejeweled online or whatever. That kind of like Java applet sort of loading directly through JavaScript kind of bridge thing was called Rhino. And there was this major flaw that was being exploited in the wild, and that was giving remote code execution, like the holy grail. to whoever was doing these attacks. And these attacks were being weaponized in this real sort of compact kind of drive-by form, right? So you click the wrong web link and bam, you're owned. So this is terrible, and it was estimated to affect over 750 million computers. And we were we maintain a disclosure program at Rapid7. One of our colleagues does, and so that involves a lot of sort of like closed door conversations with the security researchers who have found a vulnerability and want to do responsible disclosure of that vulnerability. And these researchers had disclosed to the maintainers of Java, Oracle, already. They had done it that spring, right? So by the late summer or so, it had been like significant amount of time since they had disclosed with Oracle, and then they came to us because I guess we had a little bit more of a megaphone or whatever, and we disclosed again with them, and Oracle came back and said, we needed like a really long time to patch this. I can't remember the exact amount of time, but I believe it was something like a year or 18 months to effect this patch.
Yeah, at the time, Oracle's patch cycle was 6 months, and they wouldn't guarantee a patch on anything fewer than 2 cycles out.
Right. So you're looking at potentially like a year and a half before you're going to see anything on this.
Right.
And Metasploit was in a position to basically say, as we don't care, we don't believe that that's an acceptable thing. Like you bought Sun, you've got Java, it's your thing now, and your product is vulnerable in this enormous number of computers. So we published the exploit, and I believe that Oracle had a patch out. If I recall correctly, it was like 3 days, but it was certainly less than a week later. They had a patch version of Java, and now Java, as you know, there's a kind of this spate, or you might remember around this time, of a whole bunch of bugs in sort of this general area of things, a whole bunch of vulnerabilities. And now I believe that I know that on OS 10 and on Windows, I believe pretty much anywhere you can think of, if you're going to install a browser, that browser is no longer going to have a hard dependency on Java. And if you want to do some Java stuff, you're going to need to go ahead and install it yourself in the case of like OS 10, or I'm not 100% certain how it works on Windows right now. But, Java used to just be like a dependency and just kind of just there, right, and nobody really thought anything of it. But, that's one of my favorite examples of Metasploit putting very significant pressure on a very large vendor and getting a really, really positive outcome out of it.
Man, that's interesting. There's so many different avenues I could go off of that, because we have the licensing aspect, you have kind of the script kiddies idea, you have the balancing act that you guys have to be participating in, of what do we include in, what is out. So whenever you wield a tool that's powerful like Metasploit, it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. This is where we kind of get the idea of white hat hackers, black hat hackers. Gray hats, which that was a thing back in 2006. I'm not sure. Do people still use that term?
Yeah, it's still a thing.
Just making sure. What's it mean? I don't remember. Like, you're kind of doing both? You're just...
Well, the funny thing about white, you put a little black in it, and then no matter how much more white you put on top, it's always going to be
so gray. Like you have a history? Is that what it means?
Yeah.
I see. So it's like black hat turned white. Yeah. Maybe. I don't know. That's where the intrigue comes in. That's where...
A white hat that's not necessarily entirely pure.
Got you. Okay, so you got those people, and man, there's just a lot of actors. There's a lot of interested parties, and then we have this idea of a script kiddie. Egypt, you want to kind of explain what that is, perhaps, and then maybe address Metasploit's history with these type of people.
Yeah, that's an interesting term. Script kiddie.
Is that still a term? Maybe I'm dating myself.
It is a term. Okay. It definitely is. It still exists, and people still use it.
Did you hate that term?
But I just don't think it has the meaning that it used to. It doesn't have the weight that it used to, because it used to mean that there was a script kiddie was someone who used other people's scripts and didn't have the skill to write their own, couldn't write their own exploits. But the fact is, today, you don't have to write your own exploits, because there are just so many things out there. You don't need to know the intricate details of a particular heap allocator on this operating system, because most exploits, most things that get you data that let you steal credit cards, are going to be SQL injection. Now, I've seen 12-year-olds bust out SQL injections and steal stuff. Like, you don't need to be super deep into all the details of how an operating system works to steal data.
So you're saying it's just getting even easier.
Right. And that's not because exploitation has gotten easier, it's because the kind of bugs that are prevalent these days are
Mm.
different. Um, there's still a lot of memory corruption vulnerabilities, but they've gotten exponentially more difficult to exploit. So I mentioned Scape's work with Microsoft with SEH mitigations. SEH is the structured exception handler, which was sort of a generic way to allow a buffer overflow on the stack to give you code execution. And that basically killed an entire class of bugs because of that mitigation, and it's no longer generically exploitable to overflow a buffer on a stack in a Windows application. So, SEH protections in addition to stack cookies and other general exploit mitigations on memory corruption issues in Windows have made those sorts of bugs very difficult to exploit. In 1999, writing a buffer overflow required staring at a debugger and reading a lot of manuals and figuring out how it
Right.
worked. And when you were done, you had maybe 10 lines of exploit code, and it took you a couple of days. Now, if you want to exploit something in a modern browser, so say for example in Flash, you have to understand how the ActionScript bytecode compiler works in Flash, and then you have to understand the heap allocator, how that works, and then you have to understand all of the pieces of every other little thing that is necessary to control memory in that application. It's a huge thing, and there's a lot of stuff that gets in your way. And there are some techniques that make it a little easier, but in general, memory corruption is going the way of the dodo. Um, with 64-bit operating systems becoming more and more prevalent, basically all your desktops are going to be 64-bit now. So many of those things are just going away. But you have things like SQL injection, and you have command injection, and you have just passwords lying around on passwords.xls on somebody's
Right.
desktop. So, so saying someone is a script kiddie for not writing their own exploits, I just don't think has the weight that it used to. Um, there's there are a lot of ways of getting into a system. There's a lot of ways of stealing data that don't involve writing your own memory corruption
Sure.
exploit. And I think it's giving short shrift to the attackers who are very clever, but not necessarily savvy in the ways of how an operating system works.
But can't we?
Um,
Don't we just change the focus to web applications then, and you can still, let's take for instance now the vector becomes Ruby on Rails, just for instance, keep it in the Ruby camp, of course,
Sure.
Django, whatever, a web framework now, and some security researcher, say a black hat, finds a flaw in Ruby on Rails. It took perhaps a large amount of wisdom to do that. Maybe it was an easy one. Um, isn't that the kind of exploit that would end up inside of Metasploit, and then me having no knowledge of that whatsoever can just point it at a machine and run it?
Well, it has, but I mean, you would also have to find you would need the skill to find a machine that was vulnerable to that, right? You need to be able to dig that out of the sort of enormous that needle out of the enormous like haystack of kind of what the modern modern large companies or even small companies like attack surface looks like.
Uh-huh.
And then you would need to understand what to do once you've delivered that exploit, right? So I mean Egypt's point is really well taken here. I mean we talk a lot with obviously like a lot of big deal pen testers, guys who are on red teams for like Fortune 50 companies and stuff like that, who get paid to do nothing but try to break into these enormous companies that do really big deal things. And these guys will tell you that they've literally used exploits like once or twice in like a decade or dozen years long career, just simply because it's just easier than that out there, and to Egypt's point from before, I mean, we take a look and we watch what's going on in terms of what's exploited in the wild, and then we make an effort to make sure that that we are able to kind of follow along with that and have something in Metasploit that exploits something in that same way. But a lot of people are tempted to think of this, and I think that this is really you can blame media for this, right? A lot of people look at this stuff and they're like, oh, you're a hacker, you have these magic powers. Metasploit is this collection of magic skeleton keys. All I need to do is install it, and then suddenly, I can just wave a wand and break into people. I mean, that's just false. I mean, most people probably don't think about it, but it's probably easier to hack the average corporation, almost certainly, of any size, than it is to hack an individual person. Just simply because there's
absolutely.
so much out there
Right.
that
More
what they call the
surface
attack
area.
surface
Exactly.
is so large. Right. And you've got, years and years of IT guys that have installed random stuff on there, or have put local admin on a particular Windows machine, and and there's attrition, people leave jobs, people forget what they installed, people, just kind of leave things around as business moves forward. So even if somebody could say find, to just extend your example, find a Rails application that's vulnerable to like the YAML injection remote code execution bug from a couple years
Right.
ago, and they can get you to, they can use that exploit. Well, I mean, Metasploit has provided a bit of code for that, and has provided a very very useful mechanism for interactivity with a nice little shell, and for delivering a payload, to be able to do something useful with that access. But what then? I mean, the classic formulation of a script kiddie is somebody who's just sort of like, praying and spraying and just seeing what happens.
Right.
But then what then? If that person actually knows how to, move laterally through the network and steal a bunch of useful data, can you really call that person a script kiddie anymore? I mean,
Maybe like a script teenager.
right, exactly. I mean, these people, I think that the term itself, while it still gets used, and even used at our expense indirectly on Mr. Robot, go look for the
Rapid
No
Nine.
spoilers. No
Rapid
spoilers. I haven't
right,
watched
exactly.
it yet.
Sorry, guys. But yeah, I mean, the era, I think, of people being able to be like accidentally very damaging, is kind of, I don't know how, and I don't know how legitimate that is anymore. I mean, it's information security, right? So there's always like caveats and long tails of problems out
Right.
there, and there's all kinds of things that are horribly insecure that are made directly available to the internet. ATMs being a fantastic example, but
Which are all running Windows XP.
yeah, which doesn't get security updates anymore, so be afraid. Um, yeah, it's just not I don't know how useful it is as like a genuine critique of the people who are actually trying to use a particular thing.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily critiquing. I'm trying to understand as somebody who's involved, with the project, is you have people using it for good and you have people using it for bad, and some of those concerns, have to maybe not weigh on you, but things that you're actively thinking about when you decide if an exploit's going to go in, when it's going to go in. In the case of your Oracle example, that was something that you used it as leverage to get them to act, which ended up being a great win, right? That was a success story. But what if they would have just been like, well, screw you guys, we're going home? Now, I mean, effectively, okay, it's their fault, not yours, but now you've given that vulnerability, that exploit, out to
Well,
to
but
the
that
masses.
attitude assumes that like we had that and other people
That's
didn't,
true.
and that we, and that's
It could get out
and
there in a
it's
different way.
well, it's already out there. That's what you need to always remember. It's already out there. We put this in because we're able to do some monitoring of various forums and whatnot, and we're able to see like
People have
these
it.
types of things are getting exploited already out there, right? Like keep in mind that the crimeware kits that you would spend a bunch of money on right now, like say you're I don't know, you're some bad actor somewhere in the world, and you decide to get on. There's basically like a Silk Road of like malware on Tor, right? You could get on there, you could buy a crimeware kit, which
They're about
comes
$1,000.
about $1,000. It's a beautiful interface. It'll come with some stuff that's it's not quite Ode because it's in the crimeware kits, but it's not in Metasploit either necessarily, right? I mean, like we are not like there's this temptation to believe that, oh, the thing I know about is Metasploit, and Metasploit's got this library of malware in it. Therefore, Metasploit must be filled with awful stuff that can be used to like own computers all over the place, which is really only true if you're not, if you're not patched, right?
Right.
So the idea that we aren't like completely that we're like on the forefront, and if we don't release something, it just won't be out there. That's tempting, but it's
It's just
totally
not
false.
true.
The bad guys are going to have this stuff.
Fair point. Fair point.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out that, especially in that Rhino case, it was already being exploited in the wild. And that's true of a whole bunch of our exploits. Already being exploited, sometimes in targeted attacks against specific organizations, and we make it available for everyone to know what the exploit is doing, which significantly lowers the value for a malware author.
Fair enough. I'm stuck back where Trevor said you got a bad actor out there trying to hack something, and I just pictured Ben Affleck sitting there at a computer. I don't know. Had to sneak that one in there. All right, let's take another break. Hear from another one of our sponsors. We'll be back because we haven't talked about Metasploit, the technology, very much, how it works, how you contribute, how you use it, those fun things. We know it's built on Ruby, but that's about all that we know at this point. So let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
For those out there working solo or on a team tracking time, you thought you were wrapping up a project until the client or your boss asked for a new feature at the last minute, and here you are stuck. You're not sure how much time you're spending on every feature, how much time you're spending on bug fixes or tweaks. Well, Harvest is a time tracking tool built for understanding where your time is going. And for developers, it takes the pain out of time tracking. Just install the Harvest Scrum extension and you can start tracking time right from issues in Jira or GitHub, and you won't have to go searching for your timesheet. Not only will you understand how much time you're spending on client work, you'll also be able to turn your billable hours into an invoice from Harvest in minutes. Harvest integrates with Stripe and PayPal to make sure you get paid fast and on time. There's built-in reporting in Harvest that lets you see how much time your projects took, so you can use that information to make better estimates in the future. For a better way to track time and invoice your clients and take the pain out of what you're doing when it comes to tracking time and invoicing, head to getharvest.com, create a 30-day free trial, and after your trial is over, here's a goodie for all of our listeners. Enter the code CHANGELOG to save 50% off your first month. Once again, getharvest.com, create a free 30-day trial, and after that trial is over, enter the code CHANGELOG for 50% off your first month. Enjoy.
All right, we are back, and I want to hear about Metasploit from a technological perspective. The software, how it works. We know it's a Ruby app. We know it used to be Perl. We know it used to be a game, an Curses-based game, which still sounds pretty rad if you ask me. But Egypt, can you give us a little bit about the software stack, how you even use it, how you install it, and then maybe how you contribute exploits?
Okay, so there's the main thing, which is Ruby, with a client console interactive front end called MSF Console. That's the Metasploit framework console. There are also a number of other standalone tools. MSF Venom is our payload generator. We also have an assembler shell that allows you to assemble x86 and x64 assembly into bytecode. All of our payloads are in the payload technology that makes sense for that particular target. So for Windows, it's written in C, and our flagship payload is called Meterpreter, the meta interpreter. It allows you to interact with a system like a normal command shell. And in fact, you can drop directly to a CMD shell or a PowerShell shell to talk to a Windows box. And all of that is written in C with a DLL as the actual payload that gets delivered. But we also have these things called stagers, which as a result of the way exploits typically work in memory corruption vulnerabilities, you have a small area where you can put your payload, which is often called shellcode. And that's restricted in size, and it's usually restricted in character set as well. So for an example, if your overflow is in like an FTP username, well, the @ symbol separates the username from the host name. So if your payload contains an @ symbol, then it's going to break the parsing and you won't get your shell. So we have encoders that get rid of those bad characters and randomize things with an XOR key. and you can create a small little piece of assembly that gets executed on the victim machine, and all it's for is to talk to the attacker machine and grab more code to execute. And that more code to execute is typically a DLL that allows us to do arbitrarily whatever you want.
We should probably
so
explain the payload, like the payload versus exploit sort of dichotomy here for people that don't understand it.
Right. Yeah, that's a good idea. So, in general, an exploit takes advantage of a vulnerability. There's some bug on a target system that I can take advantage of. So I use an exploit to do that. That's the terminology. The exploit will deliver a payload as part of the normal protocol that it speaks to the victim machine. So in like an HTTP example, if the server is listening on port 80, I connect up to it on port 80. I send my malicious request, which contains a payload. That payload executes on the victim machine, and then somehow it communicates back to me. Sometimes that's through TCP, sometimes that's HTTP. But either way, the payload is running on the victim machine, and it talks to the attacker machine. And that gives us the ability to control that machine, to get it to create new sockets so that we can talk to other machines that it can see inside its own network. So if I'm out on the internet and there's a machine on a DMZ, I compromise it, and now I can see all of the other machines on the inside of its network that I wouldn't be able to see from the internet. So an exploit executes a payload. The payload talks to a handler. That's the thing on the Ruby side that allows you to interact with it from a user perspective. And from there, you can drop into an interactive shell as well and run commands that will get executed on the target machine. So that's the general workflow of an exploit. You use an exploit, you set all the options necessary to take advantage of that vulnerability. It runs a payload on the target machine. That target machine connects back to you and gives you a shell through the handler. And then from there, you commence your post-exploitation activities. And we have a whole bunch of modules that make post-exploitation easier and that make it a little more robust in terms of the kind of data you can get a hold of. And one of my favorite things is a tool called Mimikatz that's been integrated into Metasploit.
I'm liking the sound of this.
What that does is it roots around in the memory on a Windows machine and finds all of the authentication structures inside lss.exe, which is the thing that does authentication in Windows. It roots around in its memory using the Windows debugging API and pulls out the structures that are necessary to do authentication. And in many cases, it can pull out plain text passwords for everyone who's logged in.
Wow.
So that's really, really super useful. If you don't get plain text passwords from that, you can still often get NTLM hashes. And if you're at all familiar with the way Windows authentication works, an NTLM hash is essentially a password.
Oh, this is my favorite thing. We got to talk about this.
Yeah.
When I first got into information security, working at Rapid7, I kept hearing about pass the hash, which sounded,
illegal,
like a drug thing or something, right? Exactly. And it's kind of astonishing if you've been working in web application development or something for a long time, because what it means is in Windows authentication, right? And probably quite a few of the people listening to this podcast, whether they actually ever touch Windows or not, they're very likely to be dealing with an Active Directory domain controller, right? Like if you have Outlook as your, or
Sure.
Microsoft Exchange as your email solution, right? Then a whole lot of things do single sign-on, right?
Right.
They make this happen. So what happens in Pass the Hash is that the client is actually responsible for creating the hash, as opposed to in a web application where you take in a plain text password, you run it through your hashing function, you compare that to what you've stored in the database. I mean, hopefully, that's what you're doing, right? That's not what happens. The client itself is actually doing the hashing and sending the hashed data over to the authentication mechanism. So what you have there is exactly what Egypt just said. Effectively, if you can steal a hash, you can pass it and use it as a password. So this is the basis for a lot of like lateral movement through networks, right? I mean, quite a bit of the time you'll find that for expediency, back in the day, some IT guy set up 5 or 6 machines with local admin access, and that local admin, is using the same password that all the guys in the IT department knew, and now you can take that same thing and you grab that hash and you can pass it around. So the one of the many things that you can do with Metasploit after you've compromised the machine, after you have a session on there, is scrape all different kinds of passwords out of all different kinds of files. Right? We've got obviously ones to do the classic Windows stuff and grab all of those, but then we've also got things like stealing a KeyPass database if you can find one on the machine, scraping Skype hashes from wherever they're located on whatever type of platform you've just victimized, right? And bringing them all and handing them over to offline cracking tools like John the Ripper or something like that. So, you can go through and just start running them through a cracker, and then hopefully, hours or days later or whatever, you've got a whole bunch of nice passwords that you can start replaying in different places.
Yeah, and in some cases, you don't need to do any kind of cracking. So Windows has this awesome thing called crypt secure data and crypt unsecure data, which is the API intended specifically for storing secret stuff in Windows. But if I'm running as your user, I can unencrypt all of the stuff that you have encrypted as that
Right.
user. So you can just ask the operating system, and it'll give you all of those secrets for free.
If you have that user's privileges at the time, right?
Exactly.
So that's fun.
So if I'm running as you and you can do anything at all without using your password, then I have your password.
Well, that doesn't sound very awesome for me. So let's say that I'm a budding network administrator, or let's say that I'm a app developer with a network that I'm interested in running some of these things against, or maybe I just want to play with it and see what it does. How do you get started with Metasploit? How do you use it as an end user?
Well, for an IT admin, I would suggest starting with the Community Edition, which is the Rails GUI that's sort of the basis for our commercial editions, because it gives you a lot of the power of the console interface, but it's point and click, and it's got a less steep learning curve. If you really want to dive into it, the console does have a slightly higher learning curve, but it does have faster access to some aspects of the framework. So I'd say when you're first getting started, community is absolutely the way to go.
Yeah, and I would say that's definitely true. Unless you're just like you love CLI, you want to dive in on the command line. It's very easy to grab the code. There's also we distribute we're with Kali Linux, which is a big open source sort of penetration testing Linux distribution. So the framework is available like right out of the box right there, along with a bunch of other really fun tools. Pretty much everything that we mentioned for the most part on this call. And I would say that also I personally, when I was getting up to speed on the application when I joined Rapid7, I know that some of the content is a little bit out of date, but the No Starch Press book, Metasploit Unleashed, which was written by a bunch of sort of longtime contributors and sort of friends of the family, basically a bunch of penetration testing people, is a really good book just sort of for understanding like how to get started, how to use this, how to kind of like get your head around like what the framework does and why it's powerful.
Might be a good time to mention that there is, as you guys said, there's a divide between the open source BSD licensed Metasploit framework and I believe what's called the Metasploit project, which is
Well, the commercial editions really is what we call them at Rapid7.
Okay.
So, right. So we have like a lot of commercial open source things. We have like a couple different like price points with different features turned on or off, right? The framework is the engine of all of those things, though. So,
so what's
yeah,
outs-
we have the
what's outside of the framework? What's in the proprietary ones?
Metasploit Pro contains things like a Jasper Reports based reporting engine. It has a whole really nice social engineering toolkit that you can use. I like to tell people it's sort of like an evil online marketing system in a way, because like you can use it to like create a little website and then like create an email and generate links that are like that have tags like to you can upload like an Excel spreadsheet of like all the people in your org, and then you can basically try to fish them and see like, okay, Joe opened the email but didn't click on it. Mary didn't even open the email. But Frank opened the email, clicked on the link inside it, and then filled out the form on the resulting web app and hit submit, and we stole his creds. So, Frank's got to go for security training or whatever, right? So quite a few of our customers really enjoyed using that. They can kind of like click. They can clone an existing website if they want to or whatever.
Wow.
And they
So
can
you
kind
can
of like,
deceive your own employees into
right.
it's a little bit weird.
But it is a little weird, but at the same time, most of the major breaches that anybody could name off the top of their head for the last couple of years have been what we refer to at Rapid7 as deception-based attacks. So it's very germane. Like it really, really is. And you'd be surprised how many people can fall for this. Now, granted, if you're creating one of these things and you've got internal knowledge of the company,
Yeah.
You're kind of tempted to sort of go a little bit out of the bounds of where you would normally go, just kind of naturally. But that's available in
hold
there.
hold on there. I think that insider knowledge isn't always all that inside. So, as an example, the first phishing campaign that I ever did, that I was ever involved with, there were public rumors about a merger with this company that we were targeting and another company, and so we sent a phishing email with a PDF containing an exploit in it, and the subject of the email was basically the merger has gone through, and this PDF contains a list of everyone who's getting fired. And
Yeah, fair point. Like at that point, I don't know whether that's just preying on human nature or what, but
that's pretty compelling content, right?
right, like who's not going to open that?
I would see that as one of the most suspicious things ever to come into my inbox. But maybe that's just me after spending 4 years on Metasploit.
Yeah, I think you're probably pretty unique in that regard. I think.
But I mean, there are a couple other like larger features that are available inside Pro, and most of those are a bit effectively to help people who are kind of in the security admin space run a collection of Metasploit content and then do some things and report on what it was able to do in a sort of in a nice kind of automated, orchestrated fashion, right? Whereas the framework is all kind of nitty gritty, hands on. You can script it, but that's a lot of work to really scale your way up, right? Versus Pro is going to give you a nice GUI interface for dealing with, for instance, maybe you've compromised hundreds of machines at the same time, and you want to run, the same 2 or 3 modules on all of those machines and have that all be part of like one big report or something like that. That would be a pain in framework, and it's very simple in Pro. So Pro is all about scalability, communication with other people, communicating up to your bosses or your stakeholders, that kind of thing.
Very cool. Well, guys, we got to take one more break. I still want to talk about InfoSec and open source and the relationship between the two. It seems like there can be a bit of a divide. Obviously, Metasploit is a big success story where you have open source and InfoSec, and maybe some ideas around how we can bridge those gaps. And of course, on the other side of the break are awesome closing questions. So stay tuned for that, and we will be right back.
This week we have a sponsored repo to mention from our friends at Transloaded. Transloaded is a versatile file uploading and encoding service, and they've asked us to give a shout out to their open source project, TUS. It's a new open protocol for resumable uploads built on top of HTTP. It's simple, it's cheap, and it's available for any language on any platform on any network. Supports checksums, parallel uploading of chunks, no more lost cat videos. It's MIT and open source. Some smart minds have collaborated on it, like the author of HTTP 1.1, employees at Google and Yahoo, Vimeo's director of engineering, ZeroMQ's creator, and there are implementations being pushed out for all major languages and frameworks. Also, Vimeo has already announced to use this open protocol for their new video uploading services, and the 1.0 of their protocol is nearing completion as we speak. They are calling for a final round of feedback on their pull request, which will link up in the show notes before releasing it. So if you're at all interested, go to tus.io. That's TUS.io, or head to the link we mentioned in the show notes to check out that pull request for 1.0's feedback. And now back to the show.
All right, we're back. And I think, Trevor, I'll point this one at you because we kind of talked about this briefly at GopherCon. You have these two communities. You have the open source developer community. You have the InfoSec community. seems like there's some overlap, and maybe the actual distinction is kind of the maker community and the breaker community to a certain degree. Um, and it seems like we don't mesh very often. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and it's something that I've found curious in my involvement with Metasploit, and it's certainly something that I think Egypt and I share a desire to help change that, right? So, that's part of why we gave our talk at Lone Star RubyCon like a month ago, just sort of trying to get people understanding like here are the types of challenges that we tackle that don't necessarily have anything to do with security per se. Building a good network client. Dealing with all the different types of abstractions that your business logic requires of you and things like that, right? These are just programming tasks. And I think that probably what we're really looking at is a historical situation more than anything else, right? So that gives me hope. I don't think that there's anything inherent or intrinsic that makes it difficult for people to spend any time on this, other than just historically, I think a lot of people who are developers maybe haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how executables are structured or thinking about how networks work or things like that. I think on the other side of it, quite a few people who write a lot of code in the security world, they are writing code under the gun. They're on that like 5 or 6 day timeline that Egypt mentioned before, where they actually have 4 days for real because of their contractual obligations otherwise. So people who are writing this stuff sometimes are putting something together that isn't really designed to live very long. And maybe they finished something and it was great and they got it to work really well in their engagement, their pen test engagement, and they say, you know what, I'm going to clean that up a little bit and I'm gonna send that over to Metasploit as a pull request, right? But we get a widely varying level of quality in the code that people want to submit to the framework. And I think in part that's just because a lot of people who have been spending a lot of time doing security have not necessarily been spending much time trying to make good software. So when kind of Egypt and I have these kinds of conversations about this kind of thing, we kind of ask ourselves, what can we do to help bridge that gap and help get some of these people who are sort of security inclined thinking more in terms of good software practices. So we've got a pretty extensive set of things that someone's going to need to do in order to do a pull request onto the framework. It'll be different if it's purely just a Metasploit module, a piece of content, than if they're actually trying to hack on like the core of the framework itself. There'll be different levels of sort of requirement. We have a lot of you need to provide external verification steps, potentially hopefully provide like a way to acquire a piece of software that may be vulnerable to this or that you could use to verify it. But especially in offensive security, you have the challenge of like, do I even have access to the thing that you're giving me an exploit for, right? Like, is it some insanely expensive piece of like enterprise software that we're just not going to be able to put into one of our labs, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that as security, information security becomes much more of a thing outside of a cloister, and it's much more prevalent in these big breaches that constantly happen, and the president getting up there talking about it, et cetera. It kind of comes to the fore a little bit more. You'll start to see developers thinking a little bit more holistically and thinking a little bit more in terms of those types of projects. And then naturally, I think the proclivity of developers, the things they want to spend their time on outside of work, the sort of classic direction that people move into to try to say, oh, what am I going to spend my open source contribution time doing? We really hope to kind of position ourselves to benefit from that sort of trend over time. I do think there's some convergence there, but maybe I'm just a closet optimist. I don't know.
Speaking of that last point, something that's been long a tradition of info security folks is the capture the flags. I'm assuming that still goes on. I used to do that back in college. It was lots of fun. And it seems like recently there's been kind of like official ones put on like by Stripe and perhaps a few other where a company will host a CTF. And whether those are, legit vulnerabilities or, hard or easy or whatever, they do spur interest and they kind of bring ideas around secure practices to a larger group of people than the ones who are already doing it. What are your thoughts on those type of activities?
I think you're completely right about that. I mean, I don't really do CTF, but my understanding is that the average CTF is significantly harder than the average pen test engagement in terms of just sort of being an intellectual challenge.
That makes sense, actually. Yeah,
getting you
somebody actually thought
right.
about like designing a way in as opposed to just your typical open FTP server, right?
Right, exactly. And the thing that you're supposed to do is significantly more difficult,
it's more like
right?
a puzzle.
I mean, Right, or like in the case of of DEF CON, like it's kind of the World Series or Super Bowl or whatever your sports metaphor is of CTF, and you're really what you end up doing is reversing binary software, like live, right? So it's not these. I think that you're absolutely right though, that will probably, just as sort of a fun intellectual challenge, could provide kind of a way in. You know what I mean? I think that the challenge to security practitioners, to information security people now, is to kind of realize where their jargon is and where their kind of collected sort of hidden knowledge is, and the knowledge that they assume amongst people they talk to, and realize that they might be talking to a software person who's an extraordinarily adept creator of software
Mm-hmm.
and really doesn't know the security landscape, but given the right kind of particular pieces of knowledge, could really be somebody who's a benefit to the information security world. I think that's kind of the attitude that Egypt and I both approach it with, is that there's just a lot of latent capability out there. So yeah, I think we've kicked around ideas for years about how could we get more people who are more software oriented, thinking in terms of security, and really, frankly, people who are security people thinking a little bit more in terms of good
Right.
software practices. I think there's definitely an opportunity for people to kind of meet in the middle
Yeah.
on that.
Well, hopefully here at the changelog we can help facilitate such things. I think even just having a conversation around it brings up people thinking about such topics. So hopefully we'll have more, gosh, can I say synergies and get away with it?
Sometimes you can. Sometimes
I think
it
I just
works.
did. I think I just did.
Sometimes it's the word you need.
All right. Well, I think it's time for our closing questions. So y'all know the drill. I'm going to start with Egypt and ask you, who is your programming hero?
I think my programming hero, is a former coworker named Michael Milvich, who was just amazing in his breadth of knowledge. He knew a little bit about everything, from how compilers work at the base fundamental levels to the Python VM to everything basically. And what really made him special to me as a colleague was that his depth was at least as impressive as his breadth. So he knew a lot about everything, and that was really inspiring to me, and it got me looking into a lot more things, and really challenging myself to be a better programmer.
Awesome. Trevor, how about yourself?
Yeah, I've been spending so much time in Go in the last year, and I've been watching kind of all this sort of constant controversy of people being like, "Oh, it doesn't have my favorite thing in it," or whatever. And I've been pretty severely impressed with Rob Pike, who's kind of a legend in the programming world. But this whole idea that like there could be a much better language. We could go back to some of our basic principles and say, look at these old principles from C and from some early Unix programming, and say, there's some really great ideas here. There are some fundamentals, and if we keep our language very small, and if we really sort of chart a particular course and not waver from that course, and not kind of like bring in every idea that everyone's ever had, we'll be making something kind of interesting. I'm always a big fan of the idea of creativity within constraints. And it's been interesting to watch this guy who's, I doubt he ever really considered himself somebody who's going to become like this, person who is sort of kind of the high priest of a programming language in the same way that he has. But it's been nice to watch the way that the sort of the Go authors have been very, I would say, very generous with their time, and very interested in the reactions that people have to the things that they've built. But they also kind of maintain that they've got a vision for what this thing can be, and they kind of stick to that. And it's been cool to watch. I'm also like kind of in awe of Yehuda Katz, and I know a lot of people probably mentioned him on this program, but the guy like just makes things that need to exist. And as a sort of a practically minded person, I really appreciate that. I remember Rails dependency management before Bundler. I really appreciated a couple times I've needed to write a CLI tool in Ruby. Really appreciated the existence of Thor.
Amen to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that somebody like, sits down, he's going to write something in Rust, and he's like, well, I need Bundler for Rust, so I guess I'll just make it. And that kind of attitude, as somebody who spends a lot of time dealing with open source stuff, that kind of attitude is just,
That's like huge. The ultimate yak shave, right? Like I'm going to write something in Rust. I need a dependency manager, and, months
Yeah,
later,
pretty
here
much,
comes
but
the cargo.
here we are all
Yeah,
benefiting
exactly.
from it, right?
Very
So,
cool.
Hats off.
Okay, last one. We're running low on time here. Is what would you be doing if you weren't working on Metasploit? And Egypt, we'll start with you.
I would probably be penetration testing networks, breaking into stuff, stealing things. Security has always been my passion, and programming has been the means to that. And if not penetration testing of networks, I would be reverse engineering binaries, staring at debuggers and disassemblers all day long. And in fact, that's what I was doing before I came to the Metasploit team.
So elite. Egypt, so elite. Love it. How about you, Trevor?
I've always liked early stage startups. I like sort of chaos and the interesting opportunities that come out of it. So I would probably be off doing something on my own, probably in like agricultural tech. I'm really fascinated by the intersection of like maker technologies and the whole sort of like, I don't even know if you can call it the food movement, but I guess kind of the food movement. So something in that area.
Just speaking to that briefly, I actually listened to a great podcast this morning on Econ Talk. Have you ever heard of Econ Talk? It's a economics podcast out of Stanford, I believe. I'm a bit of an economy nerd from time to time. All about ag tech and kind of the return of nature that's been happening. I'll link that up in the show notes. It's pretty interesting to see the results of some of the advancements that we've made recently in ag tech. Very cool. Well, guys, man, this was such a fun time. I could probably talk to y'all for hours about these things, mostly because I'm so rusty that I'll just sit here and say, is this still a thing? Is that still a thing? As you can tell by now.
Well, I'll come down to Austin and hang out.
It might have to happen. Where can we find you? So, of Metasploit.com on the internets. What's a good way to get a hold of you?
Well, I'm Egypt, EGYP7 on Twitter. We also maintain Pound Metasploit on Freenode, and I'm in there all the time.
And Tur?
Yeah, same for me. I'm Trevor Rosen on Twitter and GitHub both. I mock politicians frequently on my Twitter account, so it's not really my professional thing, but there it is. I also talk about code. So
if you're pretty politically aligned, you may not want to follow Trevor on Twitter because he may make you angry.
It could be, yeah. Or even if it's not politics, it might make
it just might happen. Very cool. Well, thank you guys again for joining me today. I also want to thank our awesome sponsors for this episode. That is CodeShip, TopTal, Harvest, and Transloaded. We appreciate your support. And if you love the changelog, we would love if you would help support those companies as well. Give a little bit of a tease to upcoming shows here. In case you have not hit the subscribe button quite yet, we have the hybrid group coming on to talk about Cylon.js, GoBot, and the Internet of Things.
Yeah, I love
we have Rethink DB. Follow up with the earlier interview we had with the CTO there, as well as Saran Yabarak with Code Newbie upcoming. All sorts of fun stuff. Make sure you subscribe. And with that, until next time, let's say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.